Think about the year 1908, when the mountains of West Virginia were more than just beautiful places to look at. They were like natural fortresses, places where federal law barely reached, and whole communities lived by their own rules. In this quiet place, between cliffs covered in oak trees and streams that were cold even in the summer, two people came out of the shadows of unofficial history, Abigail and Silas. That fall, the siblings came to Webster County. No one knew exactly where they came from, and not many people were brave enough to ask. She had a piercing gaze, hair as black as coal, and a stance that scared even the strongest men in the area. His brother had big shoulders from using an axe since he was a kid, and his silence was more threatening than any words. The brothers chose a deserted piece of land on the higher slopes, where the trees were so thick that it took hours for the sun to reach the ground. The family that had lived in the wooden house before them had left it behind in a hurry. The oldest residents say that no one asked questions when the two were there. In that area, asking too many questions could be dangerous. Abigail and Silas were invisible for the first few weeks, but then they started to show up in the small town of Webster Springs. They were always together and always serious. They bought food in silence, paid with silver coins, and then went back into the mountains before anyone could say anything. People turned away from them because there was something about them that made them feel heavy, like a shadow. The first stories started to spread during that year's harsh winter. A lumber merchant who was passing through the area said he had seen smoke rising from the brothers' property all night long. It wasn't the normal smoke from a fireplace. It was thick, steady columns, as if something big was always burning. The man just shook his head and asked for another round of whiskey when asked what it could be. More stories came out. A hunter said he heard strange noises coming from that direction, like cries that sounded human at first, but then changed into something else. A woman who sold fabrics in the city said that Abigail came to her one morning with red marks on her arms, as if she had been near a very hot fire. When she offered to help, Abigail gave her a cold stare that made her back away right away. There have always been secrets in the Appalachian Mountains. People used to just disappear. Properties would be left empty with no explanation, and stories would be buried with their main characters. The forest was so big that it swallowed everything, and the trees were so quiet that they were more powerful than any official investigation. We now know that that area had its own system of justice and its own rules that weren't written down. It took 2 days for the nearest sheriff to get there, and even when he did, he rarely found witnesses who were willing to talk. The people who lived in the mountains were more loyal to each other than to any outside authority. So, even though the winter of 1908 brought heavy snow to the mountains, Abigail and Silas kept doing their strange things, safe from the outside world because they were alone and scared. People kept talking about the smoke coming from their property, but no one dared to climb that mountain to find out what was really going on. When spring came to the mountains, the streams turned into raging torrents as the thaw set in. The trails that had been closed for months finally opened up, and new stories about the people who live in the mountains began to take shape. But these stories didn't come from people who were there. They came from whispers, from feelings, from that kind of knowledge that spreads through communities without anyone knowing how it started. During those months, Abigail started going to the city more often, always by herself and without Silas's scary presence next to her. She walked down the dirt streets with a confidence that went against the rules of the time, looking people in the eye as they passed her. The women in the city looked at her with a mix of interest and discomfort. There was something about her that didn't fit with what people expected. She was so independent that it seemed almost supernatural for the time. A merchant who had just moved to the area from Charleston made the mistake of trying to talk to her in a friendly way. He asked about the land, what they grew in the mountains, and if they needed seeds or tools. Abigail stopped, turned slowly to face him and said, "What happened in the mountains stays in the mountains." She didn't sound angry, but her voice had a weight that made the man take 3 steps back without even realizing it. At the same time, Silas had become almost like a ghost. Some people who lived nearby said they saw him chopping wood near the house, with his axe going up and down in a mechanical way. Others said he would go to the river before dawn with heavy bags that he would put in the cold water. People were curious about what was in those bags, but no one wanted to know. Since they got there, the brothers' property had changed into something else. There was a big wooden building in the back without windows, just a strong door with iron locks. There was also a barn that seemed too big for just 2 people to live in, and there was always smoke rising day and night, as if something was always being processed. A traveling salesman who sold goods and remedies in the mountains decided to try his luck on the brothers' property in June of 1909. He was a seasoned professional who was used to dealing with all kinds of customers in remote areas. He climbed the steep path with his mule full of goods, going over his most convincing speech in his head. When he got to the top, he saw Abigail sitting on the porch with a knife that shone in the afternoon sun as she peeled potatoes. When he got close, she didn't look up. The salesman started his planned pitch by talking about spices, fabrics, and good tools. Abigail kept working without saying a word. The man finally asked her if she was interested in anything after a few minutes of talking to himself. At that point, she looked up. She didn't say anything for a long time. She just looked at him with those dark eyes that seemed to see right through people. Then, in a calm, measured voice, she told him to go back to the path and never come back. There was no clear threat in what she said, but the vendor felt a chill run down his back. He hurriedly gathered his things and left without looking back. Later, the salesman told the story at the Webster Springs Tavern. He said something that really upset him. While he was talking to Abigail, or trying to talk to her, he heard noises coming from the building without windows. He couldn't quite figure out what they were, but they sounded like metal and had a rhythm to them, like heavy work was going on inside. There was a smell in the air that he couldn't place, but it made his stomach turn. When the locals heard the story, they just nodded. No one looked shocked. The brothers' land had become an unofficial landmark in the area. Everyone knew something about it, but no one knew everything. It was like the mountain had eaten them both and made them a part of its own wild and hard-to-reach nature. We can only guess what was going on up there. The Appalachian Mountains have always been places where civilization had a hard time fully establishing itself. People made their own rules and systems of justice, and Abigail and Silas seemed to be experts at this game of shadows and secrets. Summer brought with it a subtle but noticeable transformation in the dynamics between the siblings and the surrounding community. Abigail did something surprising. She started to offer her services. Not the usual things that a woman of that time would do, like cooking or sewing. No, Abigail had something much more valuable to offer in those remote mountains. Knowledge of medicinal herbs and treatments for illnesses that the area's doctors couldn't cure very often. The first person to seek her out was an elderly woman from Webster Springs who had suffered from joint pain for years. Conventional remedies offered no relief, and despair had settled like a permanent shadow over her life. Someone mentioned, almost as a cruel joke, that perhaps the woman from the mountains could help. Everyone was surprised when the woman chose to take the chance. The climb to the brothers' house was hard. The path wound its way between trees and rocks covered in moss. The trees were so old that they looked like they had seen centuries of history. The woman was out of breath and leaning on her cane when she finally got to the top. Abigail was waiting for her on the porch, as if she already knew she was coming. There were no warm greetings or unnecessary questions. Abigail simply beckoned her inside. The interior of the house was surprisingly organized. Shelves covered the walls, filled with glass jars containing liquids of various colors and dried herbs, carefully labeled with elegant calligraphy. The air was full of strong smells from plants that the woman couldn't place. Some were nice, like lavender, and others were strange and strong. Abigail prepared a specific mixture, grinding ingredients in a stone mortar with precise and deliberate movements. While she worked, she spoke little, but when she did, her words carried a profound knowledge of the nature of plants and their effects on the human body. She explained that certain roots, found only in the highest elevations, had properties that relieved inflammation, that certain tree barks, when prepared correctly, could numb pain without the side effects of commercial medicines. The woman listened, fascinated, realizing that she was in the presence of someone who mastered an ancient and almost forgotten art. The treatment worked. In a few days, the pain that had tormented the woman for years diminished considerably. She told others about her experience, and so, gradually, more inhabitants of the region began to climb that mountain seeking help. Abigail received them all with the same distant but professional demeanor, never charging fixed fees, accepting what they offered her in exchange: chickens, sacks of flour, fabrics, tools. This change created a peculiar situation. The same neighbors who whispered sinister stories about the brothers now depended on Abigail's knowledge. It was a relationship built on need and fear, respect and distrust. People climbed the mountain during the day, in the sunlight, and descended quickly before nightfall, as if the darkness might reveal aspects of that property they preferred not to know. Silas, for his part, kept his distance during these visits. He would work on the windowless construction or disappear into the forest for days on end, always returning at nightfall with that same distant and silent gaze. Some visitors would occasionally catch a glimpse of Hyman's imposing figure moving among the trees with the agility of someone who knew every stone and every root of that terrain. During one of these visits, in early August 1909, a young woman who had come seeking treatment for chronic migraines ended up staying longer than planned. Abigail had prepared an infusion that needed to be consumed gradually over several hours, and while she waited, the young woman discreetly observed her surroundings. It was then that she noticed something curious. Behind the main house, there was a meticulously cultivated garden. It was no ordinary garden. The plants there were arranged with almost scientific precision, each species separated by small wooden fences, each area marked with signs bearing Latin names that the young woman couldn't understand. Some plants had vibrantly colored flowers that seemed to glow under the light filtered through the treetops. Others were completely green, with strangely shaped leaves she had never seen in her entire life in the mountains. Abigail noticed the visitor's interest and, surprisingly, offered to show her the garden. She walked among the flower beds, explaining the properties of each plant with a knowledge far beyond what one would expect from someone self-taught. She spoke of alkaloids and organic compounds with a familiarity that suggested years of study and experimentation. The young woman was simultaneously impressed and slightly disturbed by the depth of this knowledge. As they walked, the visitor couldn't help but notice that, from a certain angle, it was possible to see the windowless building. The door was ajar at that moment, and although she couldn't see the interior clearly, there were piles of something covered by heavy tarpaulins. The smell coming from there was strong, a mix of burnt wood and something metal that made the eyes sting a little. Abigail saw the curious look and, without getting angry, said that this was Silas's work area, where he worked with wood and other materials that they sometimes sold to merchants who came from farther away. The explanation was unclear, but it was given in such a natural way that it made people not want to ask more questions. The young woman nodded and went back to looking at the medicinal plants. She decided that some questions were better left unanswered. As time went on, Abigail's reputation as a healer spread beyond Webster Springs. People from nearby counties started to make the long trip to that property on the hilltop. Some people came with physical problems, while others had problems that seemed more spiritual than physical. Abigail was happy to see them all, but there were clear limits. She never let them stay after dark, never let anyone get close to Silas's building, and never, under any circumstances, answered questions about her past or how she learned so much. This duality became the siblings' trademark. Abigail was the healer during the day. She made medicines that worked when nothing else did and eased pain. At night, the property reverted to being that mysterious place where smoke continued to rise, where strange sounds echoed through the valley, where secrets remained guarded behind locked doors and impenetrable gazes. We now observe how the brothers had created a complex existence in those mountains. They were no longer just isolated strangers, but an integral part of the community, even though they always remained on the fringes, always shrouded in an aura of mystery that no one could fully penetrate. They had found a peculiar balance between being needed and being feared, between offering help and keeping their distance. And so, summer wore on, with the Appalachian Mountains witnessing yet another chapter in this dark story, where the line between the beneficial and the disturbing became increasingly difficult to distinguish. The colors of amber and crimson that autumn brought to the mountains made the scenery look like it came from an old painting. The leaves fell in quiet streams, making a thick carpet on the trails that muffled the sound of footsteps. This time of year, when the cold started to bite and people got ready for another harsh winter, was when the Appalachian Mountains showed their saddest beauty. An unexpected event changed the way things worked in the area during this time of year. A man came to Webster Springs from a long way away, from the plains of Kentucky. He acted like a collector of old stories and someone who was interested in the legends and traditions of the mountains. He moved into the town's only inn and started asking a lot of questions about everything and everyone. Thomas was his name, and he was so curious that it made people uncomfortable. He asked about old families, empty houses, and stories they would rather not talk about. The people who lived there politely avoided answering, giving watered-down accounts of events that were much more complicated and dark than they were willing to tell a stranger. Of course, Thomas eventually learned about the Mountain Brothers. The stories came to him in pieces, with each person adding a different detail. This made for a confusing mix of facts and guesses: the mysterious healer who never smiled, the quiet brother who worked in the shadows, and the secluded property where strange things happened at night. It was too good for someone like Thomas to pass up. One October morning, when the valleys were still covered in thick mist, he chose to climb the mountain. He only had a backpack with paper, ink, and some food in it. He had to stop several times to catch his breath because the trail was steeper than he had thought. He leaned on the trunks of old trees that had seen him struggle against the harsh landscape. Thomas was impressed when he finally got to the clearing where the brothers' property was. The house was bigger than he thought it would be. It was made of dark wood that looked like it had soaked up years of rain and sun. The back building, which had no windows, stood out like a scary figure. Its door was closed, like a mouth keeping secrets that shouldn't be told. Abigail was there, as always, on the porch. She didn't seem shocked that he was there. Maybe she had the sharp hearing that comes from being alone, able to hear footsteps on the trail long before anyone else showed up. Thomas enthusiastically introduced himself and talked about how interested he was in the stories of the area. He also said that he had heard of her knowledge of medicinal plants and that he would like to record this knowledge. Abigail stared at him in silence for a long time. Her dark eyes looked at him with such intensity that Thomas felt like every part of his personality was being peeled back and looked at. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was calm, but it had something in it that he couldn't quite put his finger on. She said there were no stories to tell because her work was simple and useful, and there was nothing worth writing down. But Thomas kept going. He had been to a lot of mountains, talked to a lot of people who lived alone, and learned how to get their trust. He said he could help with heavy work because he knew how to build things and could be helpful. Abigail seemed to think about the offer for a moment, her eyes drifting to the building with no windows, as if she were weighing her options. Silas showed up at that moment. He came out of the woods like a shadow taking shape, with an axe over his shoulder and clothes covered in sap and dirt. In person, he was even scarier than Thomas had thought from the descriptions. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and had hands that looked like they could break wood as easily as dry branches. Thomas couldn't figure out what the siblings were saying to each other with their eyes. After what felt like an eternity, Silas nodded, a gesture that was almost too small to see. Abigail then turned to Thomas and said he could stay for a few days, helping with basic tasks, but there were strict rules to be followed. The rules were clear, but not open to interpretation. Thomas was not to go into the building that didn't have windows. He was not allowed to ask the brothers about their past or where they got their knowledge. He wasn't supposed to walk around the property at night, and most importantly, he wasn't supposed to try to document anything without permission. Thomas quickly agreed, and his curiosity was put on hold for a while because he needed to get into that closed world. The first few days were very interesting. Thomas helped Silas with his work in the woods by chopping wood and bringing logs to the house. The work was hard, but it gave me chances to watch. He noticed that Silas worked with almost mechanical efficiency, each movement precise and economical. He didn't talk much, and when he did, it was only to give short instructions about what to do. Thomas helped Abigail in the medicinal garden in the afternoons. She taught him how to pick certain herbs without hurting the roots, how to dry leaves to keep their properties, and how to make tinctures that would stay effective for years. She knew a lot about plants and how to prepare them, and she was very careful about it. Thomas would sometimes try to change the subject to more personal things during these sessions, but Abigail always skillfully brought it back to the topic at hand. When he asked her how she knew so much about plants, she said that the mountains teach people who are willing to listen. She changed the subject when he asked about her family by pointing out a rare plant that needed immediate care. At night, Thomas slept in a small cabin next to the main house. It was a simple room with a narrow bed and a table where he kept his papers. He could hear sounds coming from the property while he lay in the dark. Heavy footsteps moving between the buildings and doors creaking open and shut. An orange light sometimes came through the cracks in the floorboards, which made it seem like something was going on at night. Every day, Thomas's curiosity grew. He started to see patterns. He saw that Silas always worked very late on the windowless building on the same days of the week. He knew that Abigail would sometimes leave for the forest at dawn and come back hours later with bags of plants that she didn't grow in the garden. He saw that the brothers sometimes had visitors at night who wore hoods and left before dawn. Thomas messed up on the 5th day of his stay. He was so curious that he forgot about his common sense and waited until he heard his brothers working in different parts of the property before sneaking up to the building without windows. There was a small space between the 2 planks on the door where they didn't fit together perfectly. He bent down and looked through the small hole. It was dark inside, but his eyes got used to it over time. He could see shapes, long tables with tools he didn't know what they were, and shelves full of jars like the ones he had seen in Abigail's house, but there were a lot more of them. And in the middle, there was something big that was covered by a heavy tarp that hung from the ceiling like a big cocoon. At that point, he felt something behind him. He turned slowly and saw Silas standing a few steps away with his axe resting casually on his shoulder. It was impossible to see what the man was looking at, but there was something about it that made Thomas's blood run cold. There were no words. Silas just nodded toward the main house. We can picture how scared Thomas was at that moment when he realized he had crossed an invisible but very real line. He walked toward the house, and Silas followed behind. Each step felt like it took forever. Abigail was waiting for them on the porch, and for the first time, Thomas saw something in her eyes that made him really question his choice to climb that mountain. Abigail stood still on the porch with her arms crossed over her chest as Thomas walked up with Silas right behind him. The silence that hung over the property was thick and heavy, with a tension that seemed to weigh down the air itself. Thomas's hands shook a little, but he made himself stay calm. At that moment, there was something that went beyond normal fear. It felt like being in front of a silent trial. When they finally met, Abigail spoke in a low voice that broke the silence like a knife. She said that being curious and not trusting someone were two sides of the same coin, and that Thomas had picked the wrong side. She said that the rules were not just suggestions, they were important for everyone's safety. Then, as if it were no big deal, she pointed to the path that led down the mountain and told him to leave before the sun went down. Thomas didn't need any more pushing. He picked up the few things he owned from the cabin next door, feeling his brother's eyes on him the whole time. He couldn't help but look back every now and then as he hurried down the trail. The property was already gone, hidden by the trees and the mist that was starting to rise from the valleys. He would never know what was going on up there, and for the first time in his life as a story collector, Thomas was glad he didn't know the whole truth. Thomas only stayed in Webster Springs for 2 more days before leaving for good. Some people who lived there noticed that he was quieter, less likely to ask questions, and different. When someone asked him about his trip to the Mountain Brothers, he just shook his head and said that some things shouldn't be said. He then left, taking with him only bits and pieces of a story he would never finish. People in the area started to see the siblings in a different light after Thomas left. Their quick expulsion spread quickly, reminding everyone that there were lines that should not be crossed. People kept climbing the mountain to find Abigail's cures, but this time they respected the rules more. People stopped asking unnecessary questions and showing too much interest. When winter came in 1910, things started to change. Silas, who had been mostly hidden from most visitors until then, started to show up in the city from time to time. He would ride down the mountain in a cart pulled by 2 strong horses, carrying heavy boxes. The boxes were always carefully packed, and the contents were never shown to anyone. There was a merchant in Webster Springs who helped move goods to and from the mountains. Silas started sending these packages to him every month. Then, the boxes were sent to faraway places that no one in the town knew personally, like Charleston, Louisville, and even towns farther north. The merchant never said what was in them, but everyone could tell that he was doing well since they started this deal. That winter was especially hard for many families in the area because the snow covered the mountains with what seemed like an endless white blanket. The extreme cold caused a lot of respiratory illnesses that quickly spread among the people. There weren't many traditional treatments available, and they didn't work. Even the simplest homes began to feel hopeless. At that point, Abigail did something that surprised everyone. On a cold January morning, she came down to the city in a heavy, dark woolen coat and gave her medicine for free to the families that needed it the most. She didn't expect to be thanked or to get paid later. She just gave the bottles to the people with clear instructions on how much to take and when, and then she went back to the mountain before anyone could fully understand what had happened. This action made the people feel a lot of different things. How could they make sense of the kindness shown with the bad rumors going around? How could they understand a woman who could be both distant and very caring at the same time? People at the tavern talked for hours, each trying to come up with a theory that made sense, but none of them seemed to be completely right. The community was also surprised by Silas. During a very bad snowstorm that cut off a lot of families, he showed up at the most remote homes with basic supplies like chopped firewood, bags of grain, and thick blankets. He didn't say much, he just dropped off the things and then left quietly through the snow, leaving deep tracks that quickly disappeared under the constant snowstorm. Many people saw the brothers as more human after these actions, but at the same time, they made the mystery around them even stronger. Why would people who are so private and seem to be able to take care of themselves care about their neighbor's health? What made this selective kindness happen? But why, even after these gestures, did they keep that distance and those secrets that were so hard to break? Spring came, and with it came the thaw. This meant that things on the mountain property started up again. People who came to get treatments noticed small changes. The herb garden had grown a lot and now took up almost the whole side of the property. New, smaller buildings had been built, like small cabins that looked like they were used to store or dry plants. One of these visitors, a woman with long-term digestive issues, ended up talking to Abigail for longer than usual. She talked about how the property had grown and how everything seemed so well organized and productive while she waited for her medicine to be ready. Abigail said something very rare for her. She and Silas had found something in the mountains that they had never had before, the chance to live by their own rules. The visitor kept hearing that phrase in their head all the way down the mountain. What did it mean to live by their own rules in the Appalachian Mountains at that time? A lot of people lived in ways that went against what society thought was right. But the way Abigail said it made it sound like there was more to it. It was like the siblings had made not just a private estate, but a whole world with rules that only they really understood. Now we can see how the brothers had become a strange presence in the area. They were both members of the community and not members of it at the same time. They offered to help, but stayed away. They showed a lot of knowledge, but they never said where they got it from. And most importantly, they kept the secrets of the night safe. The strange things that the windowless buildings saw but didn't say anything about. In the summer of 1910, there was an unusual drought. The streams that usually flowed strongly turned into small streams, and the crops started to die in the heat. Farmers in the area were worried, and many were afraid they would lose everything they had planted. In this situation, something amazing happened on the brothers' land. Abigail's medicinal garden stayed green and lush, even though everything else around her dried up. The plants didn't seem to mind the lack of rain. Their leaves shone with life in the hot sun. Some people thought it was because of a hidden natural spring high up, while others thought it was because of special irrigation methods. Still, some people whispered less common explanations, theories that required knowledge that went beyond the practical. The flowers that bloomed in Abigail's garden that summer became more and more interesting. People who climbed the mountain looking for cures couldn't help but stare in awe at the green oasis in the dry landscape. Some of the flowers were so bright that they looked fake. They were deep purple and electric blue, which stood out sharply against the pale earth around them. Abigail never went into detail about how she kept her garden so beautiful. When asked, she just said that she paid attention to what the plants needed and that she understood their cycles and needs in ways that went beyond what most people know. She talked about her work in a way that was almost reverent, as if each plant were a being with its own will that needed to be respected and understood. During those dry months, Silas did more things on his own. He started taking orders for certain carpentry and metal work jobs. Families in the area learned that he could make tools and other things of very high quality, things that seemed to last forever and work better than anything they could find in city stores. One farmer ordered a special plow and was shocked to see that it cut through the dry ground like butter. These orders made Silas spend even more time in the building with no windows. The noises coming from there while he worked were strange. Rhythmic, metallic banging, the hiss of something being heated to very high temperatures, and sometimes a sound that sounded like water boiling violently. The smoke coming from the little building was different colors, sometimes almost clear and other times thick and dark like ink. A retired blacksmith who lived on the outskirts of Webster Springs once said that the tool Silas made for him showed techniques he had never seen before. It looked like the metal had been treated in a special way because it was denser and stronger than what was normal at the time. When he asked Silas how it worked, Silas just looked at him in a way that made it clear that some things would stay secret. As summer went on, a new person started to show up on the siblings' property from time to time. Every 2 weeks, an older woman with gray hair tied in a tight bun climbed the mountain. She didn't seem to be there for treatment like the other visitors. She just wanted to talk to Abigail for a long time. They would sit on the porch for hours, and their low voices made it hard for anyone to hear what they were saying. People in the area eventually learned that the woman was a healer and midwife from a community far away, across the mountains to the east. It seems that she came to trade information with Abigail, share skills, and learn new ways to make medicines. People in the area were interested in this relationship because it showed that Abigail's reputation had spread farther than they had thought. At the end of August 1910, during one of these visits, the older woman brought something strange with her, an old book with a worn leather cover. She gave it to Abigail on the porch, and even from a distance, those who happened to see it could tell that it was more than just a gift exchange. The way Abigail held the book with both hands and looked very focused on it made it seem like it was very important to her. No one knew for sure what was in that book, but after it came, the medicinal garden started to change in small ways. New plants showed up that no one in the area could name. Abigail started spending a lot of time watching these new plants and writing down her thoughts in notebooks that she kept very safe. Her garden was changing into something more than just a place to grow medicine. It was becoming almost like an experiment. Silas started going on longer trips during this time. He would leave at dawn with a cart full of his work and not come back for days. No one knew for sure where these trips were going, but there were rumors that he was making business connections in bigger cities, where his unique skills were more valued and where people were less likely to ask annoying questions. One of these trips happened at the same time as a big event in the area. A terrible fire hit one of the farms near Webster Springs, destroying the main barn and putting the family's home in danger. The brave but poorly planned attempts to put out the fire left the family in a terrible situation when it was all over. They lost not only buildings, but also important tools and a lot of their winter supplies. Silas found out what had happened right away when he got back from his trip 3 days after the fire. He surprised everyone by showing up at the damaged property with tools and building materials. He didn't say much, but he started working on fixing up the barn. He was very efficient. Every move was planned out, and every piece of wood was cut perfectly. Other men from the area joined in, but they were embarrassed that they hadn't done it first. It quickly became clear that Silas was on a whole other level of skill. He worked at a speed that seemed almost supernatural, lifting heavy beams by himself and putting together complicated structures as if they were simple jigsaw puzzles. A new barn, stronger than the last one, was up in less than a week. The family tried to thank them a lot and offered to pay, but Silas just shook his head and went back to his property in the mountains. This action made the brothers' unclear place in the community even more clear. They could do real acts of kindness, but they always kept that distance, that veil of mystery that made it hard to fully understand them. In response, Abigail worked harder on her experiments with the new plants. She started making even better medicines, ones that worked when nothing else did. After 2 weeks of treatment, a woman who had been having fevers every few months for years was completely better. A man with a wound that wouldn't heal saw his skin heal very quickly after putting on a special ointment that Abigail made. These successes brought in even more people, but they also made people even more curious. How could 2 people living alone in the mountains know so much? Where did these skills come from that seemed to go beyond what was normal at the time? Some theories said that the brothers had learned from masters who lived far away, maybe even in other countries. Others, who were more imaginative, said that their skills came from less common sources. When the sun went down and the doors closed, we can only guess what really happened inside that house. The brothers had made a secret world for themselves, with its own rules and information that they kept to themselves. They helped the community, but only on their own terms. They always had complete control over what they shared and what they kept secret. Once more, autumn had come, and the mountains were changing as they do every year. The leaves fell again, making the colorful carpet that covered paths and clearings. As nature finished another cycle, Abigail and Silas kept working on their secret project. They were two mysterious people who had become an important part of that dark and beautiful landscape. The winter of 1911 was even colder than the winter of 1910. The mountains became a place of ice and silence, where the sounds of the forest seemed frozen in the thick air. During the worst seasons, when each property was an island surrounded by a cruel white sea, the true nature of isolation became clear. In this situation, something amazing started to happen on the brothers' land. Visitors who were able to make the hard trip up the mountain, fighting through the deep snow, noticed something strange. Even from the outside, the building without windows gave off a noticeable heat. The snow around it melted in a perfect circle, which made the rest of the area look like it was covered in perfect white. Silas had come up with a way to heat his home that was beyond what was possible at the time. The heat that was made was not only enough to keep the inside of that strange building at a comfortable temperature, but it also spilled out into the outside world, suggesting that there was a lot of energy there. Some people thought about special furnaces, while others thought about ways to use the mountain's geography to move heat from the Earth's core. The siblings' main house became a safe place for travelers who got lost in the storms during those cold months. People trying to cross the mountains and getting stuck in the snow have sought shelter on that property more than once. Abigail would greet them with few words and offer them hot tea made with her special herbs and a place by the fire to warm up. These guests, who didn't know what was going on, would always talk about how strange the house felt. Everything was perfectly in order. Each item had its own place, and there was an almost obsessive sense of order in every room. The shelves were full of jars, and it looked like they were organized in a way that only Abigail could understand. The books piled up in certain corners were all about botany, chemistry, and other topics that most people living in the country at the time would never have thought were important. One of these travelers, a merchant who was on his way to Charleston when he got stuck in a blizzard, spent 3 days on the siblings' property. He saw routines that he thought were interesting during that time. Abigail would get up before dawn and spend hours in her garden, even when it was snowing, checking on plants that seemed to have survived the extreme cold with some kind of special protection she had made. Silas, on the other hand, would go into the building with no windows right after breakfast and not come out until nightfall. The merchant noticed that while he was gone, there were always sounds coming from inside the building. There were the metallic beats of hammers, the hiss of materials being heated, and sometimes even the sound of glass being molded. It was clear that a lot of work was going on there, but what kind of work was still a mystery. On the 3rd night of his forced stay, the merchant saw something that really caught his attention. He heard movement in the house late at night, when he thought everyone was asleep. He quietly looked through the crack in the door of the room they had given him and saw Abigail and Silas going down to the basement with lanterns. They were down there for over an hour, and when they came back, they had boxes that they hadn't had before. The merchant was able to continue on his way after the storm passed, but he still had more questions than answers. He thanked them a lot for their hospitality and offered to pay, but they politely turned him down. Abigail just said that the mountains taught people to help each other and that being together wasn't a business deal. But there was something in her eyes that made the merchant think there was more to it than what he could see. When he got back to civilization, he told people about his time in different taverns along the way. The tale of the strange mountain brothers began to reach places that were farther away. Some versions stayed true to the costumes, while others got more complicated and fantastical as they were told and retold. The brothers were becoming famous people who lived somewhere between reality and myth. There was a big change in the spring of 1911. A young woman came to Webster Springs from Tennessee to find Abigail. Through networks of healers and midwives that spanned the Appalachian region, she had heard about a woman who knew a lot about plants and how to make medicines. The young woman wanted to learn and was willing to work for free in exchange for lessons. Many people were surprised that Abigail said yes. This was the first time someone had been told they could stay on the property for a long time. Margaret, a young woman, climbed the mountain with only a few things and a strong will that even the most doubtful people in the area were impressed by. Her eyes were so intense that they made it clear she wouldn't take no for an answer. In the months that followed, Margaret was always in the medicinal garden. Abigail taught her with surprising patience, showing her not only which plants to use, but also how to understand their cycles, how to tell when they were ready to be picked, and how to make each type of remedy with the exact amount of care needed to make it work best. It was a transfer of knowledge that went far beyond the technical, almost as if Abigail were giving a whole philosophy. Margaret also talked to Silas, but not as often. He taught her the basics of carpentry and metalworking, like how to make simple tools that she could use as an independent healer in the future. The three respected each other and had an unspoken agreement that they were all committed to knowledge that most people didn't value or understand. In the summer, the property changed in a big way. There was more movement and life when Margaret was there, in a way that hadn't been there before. She sang while she worked in the garden, breaking the quiet that usually filled the space. Abigail seemed to like this, even though she didn't show her feelings very often. Sometimes, when Margaret made a silly mistake or said something very smart, Abigail would smile a little. But Margaret also quickly saw that there were strict rules. There was still no way to get into the building without windows. The siblings were the only ones who could use the basement of the main house, and some conversations, especially those about Abigail and Silas's past, were strongly discouraged. Margaret was smart enough to stay within these limits because she knew that the knowledge she was gaining was worth any loss of curiosity. Now we can see how Margaret's presence changed that dark story in a new way. For the first time, the brothers had let someone really enter their isolated world. This person was not just a temporary visitor or a guest who had to be there because of circumstances, but someone who was really part of their daily lives. This showed a trust that they didn't easily show, or maybe a need to make sure that their knowledge didn't die with them. Over the course of several months, it became clear that Margaret was learning not just the techniques, but also the ideas behind the brothers' work. She started to realize that each plant was different and that each preparation needed not only technical skill, but also a kind of intuition that came with time and careful observation. She was changing from a simple apprentice into something more, a keeper of ancestral knowledge. That fall, a number of things happened that would change how the community saw the siblings forever. Margaret had been an apprentice for almost 6 months when a fever epidemic started to spread through the area. It wasn't terrible, but it mostly hurt the weakest people, who were bedridden for weeks with severe chills and occasional delirium. Traditional treatments didn't work for that specific illness. Families tried everything they could think of, from old poultices to herbal teas, but the fever wouldn't go away. At that point, Abigail and Margaret went down to the city together for the first time ever, carrying boxes full of special things. They set up a kind of temporary outpost in the church, which was the only building big enough to hold all the patients who needed care. The two worked almost non-stop for 3 weeks, giving their preparations and keeping a close eye on each patient. Abigail showed a level of clinical skill that surprised even those who already knew how good she was. She was able to spot small differences in the disease that needed different treatments. Margaret was a great student who used what she had learned with more and more confidence. She was very gentle with her patients, which was a great fit with Abigail's more direct style. They made a surprisingly good team, and slowly but surely, each patient started to get better. During that time of trouble, Silas also did his part. He made more beds for the church, set up structures to help the rooms get enough airflow, and came up with simple but clever ways to help patients stay hydrated even when they were at their weakest. His quiet but steady presence made people feel safe and helped calm their fears. The community was very thankful when the epidemic finally ended without any deaths. There were plans to throw parties and give the 3 big rewards for their hard work, but Abigail, being Abigail, just said that they had done what was needed and nothing more. Then, just as quietly as they had come, she and Margaret went back to the mountain, leaving behind a very impressed group of people. This event changed the way the siblings and Webster Springs got along. The fear and distrust that had always been there in this relationship started to fade away, and real respect began to take its place. People still didn't fully understand Abigail and Silas, but they could now see that they had a sense of responsibility to the community that went beyond their choice to stay away from others. Margaret, on the other hand, was almost done with her apprenticeship. She had learned a lot in a short amount of time, but more importantly, she had developed the gut feeling that set a good healer apart from a truly great one. Abigail knew this, and on a quiet November afternoon, she told Margaret that she was ready to go her own way. There was a private ceremony between the 3 of them to say goodbye. Abigail gave Margaret a set of tools for making medicine that Silas had made just for her. They were of such high quality that they would last a lifetime. She also gave her a thick notebook full of notes on plants, how to prepare them, and things she had seen over the years. It was a priceless gift, a formal transfer of knowledge that made Margaret cry with gratitude. Margaret asked a question she had been thinking about for months before she left. She wanted to know why the brothers chose to live in such a remote place, and why they kept so many secrets when it was clear that they had skills that could make them famous and rich in any city. For a long time, Abigail didn't say anything. She was staring off into the distant mountains. She finally said that some people are meant to live in the structures that society makes, while others need to make their own structures to stay alive. She said that the mountains were not only a safe place for her and Silas, but also a place where they could be themselves without fear of judgment or having to explain themselves. It was an answer that made a lot of sense and at the same time didn't make any sense, which is how Abigail usually talked. Margaret came down the mountain on a clear December morning. She brought with her not only useful information, but also a deep understanding that the world was much more complicated than simple stories made it seem. She would start her own business in a faraway town and become a respected figure in her own right, but she would never forget those months high up, learning from 2 of the most amazing people she had ever met. The estate went back to being quiet after Margaret left. Winter came in 1912, bringing with it the usual problems of snow and cold. The siblings went back to their strange routines, but something had changed in a small way. The wall that kept the siblings apart from the rest of the world had a small but important hole in it because of the epidemic and Margaret's presence. People who climbed the mountain now had to walk a little less distance. Abigail would sometimes tell short stories about certain plants that gave hints about how she had learned certain skills. Silas, who was mostly quiet, sometimes showed off his skills more openly by teaching people who were really interested in learning the basics of metallurgy. But the building without windows was still off limits. It kept smoking in a strange way, and the thick walls kept echoing with metallic sounds. No one but Silas ever went through that reinforced doorway. It seemed like the brothers had agreed to be a little more honest about some parts of their lives, but there were some secrets that were so important to their lives that they could never tell anyone. We can now think about how the Appalachian Mountains held so many stories like this one. Stories of people who lived by their own rules and made their own worlds in the high, hard-to-reach places. Abigail and Silas were an interesting example of this type of person. They were both generous and reserved, skilled and mysterious, and they didn't fit into any one category. In a few months, spring would come again, bringing with it the thaw and renewal. New chapters of this dark story would continue to unfold, with each season adding new layers to a mystery that the mountain itself seemed to guard jealously. Over the next few years, the way the people in the area saw the mountain siblings changed slowly but deeply. Abigail and Silas had become almost legendary figures, a part of the emotional landscape of the Appalachians in that area. During the long winters, people told their stories around the fire. Each storyteller added their own details, and each version was a little different from the last. Eventually, it was hard to tell what was true and what was made up. The property on the hilltop did better than anyone thought it would. Abigail's medicinal garden had grown so much that it now took up almost a third of the space around the house. She had made special microclimates for different kinds of plants by using clever structures that Silas had built. These included movable covers that kept the plants safe from too much sun, irrigation systems that used rainwater in surprisingly effective ways, and even small greenhouses made of glass that he got from secret sources. People who traveled to the top of the mountain said the garden looked like something from a dream. There were areas for fragrant plants that made the air smell different at different times of the day. In other areas, there were species that Abigail had learned to live with in that harsh climate. These were plants that shouldn't be able to survive at those heights, but they thrived under her special care. It was like she had made a secret language with nature. Silas, for his part, had refined his skills to a level that seemed almost artistic. The things he made, like tools and other things, were not only useful, but they also had a beauty that went beyond just being useful. The rake he made for a farmer had lines that were so well balanced that it looked like a work of art. He made Abigail a set of knives to use on plants that were so sharp and well balanced that she could cut the most delicate herbs without hurting a single fiber. The windowless structure had expanded over the years. Silas added a side extension, also without visible openings, also constantly active with those metallic sounds and that peculiar smoke. The original building was already large, but with the addition, it became a genuinely impressive structure, dominating one side of the property like a temple dedicated to unknown practices. During the spring of 1914, something unexpected happened. A group of people arrived in Webster Springs, 3 men and 2 women, all dressed in a refined manner that contrasted sharply with the simpler style of the local inhabitants. They said they were academics who wanted to record traditional mountain medicine practices. Their leader, a middle-aged man with gold-rimmed glasses, explained that they were preparing a compendium of folk healing knowledge. Of course, someone brought up Abigail. The scholars were interested in what they heard and asked to visit the property. The locals exchanged meaningful glances, remembering what had happened to Thomas years before, but one of the scholars was particularly insistent, arguing that it was important to preserve this kind of knowledge before it was lost to time. They sent a messenger up the mountain to see if Abigail would see the visitors. The reply came the next day. She agreed to meet them, but only with 2 members of the group at a time, and on the explicit condition that they would not attempt to make written records during the visit. They could observe, ask questions, but any documentation would be based purely on later memory. The academics agreed, and 2 of them made the climb on a sunny morning. What happened during that visit became the subject of much speculation. They spent the entire day on the property, returning only at nightfall with expressions that mixed admiration with something close to discomfort. When questioned about the experience, they were surprisingly evasive. The group leader, Dr. Hamilton, commented only that Abigail possessed a knowledge that went far beyond what they expected to find in a rural healer. He mentioned that she spoke about chemical compounds and biological interactions with a sophistication that rivaled university professors he knew. But there was something in her approach, he said, something in the way she understood plants that transcended mere science. It was almost as if she had access to dimensions of knowledge that modern academia had forgotten or never discovered. The other academics visited on subsequent days, each pair returning with similarly conflicting impressions. Everyone agreed that Abigail was special, but they didn't want to go into too much detail about what made her approach so different. One of them discreetly mentioned that he had seen things in the garden plant arrangements that made no sense according to conventional botanical principles, but that clearly worked in some way he couldn't explain. Silas remained virtually invisible during these academic visits. Visitors sometimes saw him in the distance, working on something, but he never came up to them or showed any interest in talking to them. To them, he was just a ghostly figure, a shadow that moved on the edge of their minds. He was always there, but never really there. The academics who finally left Webster Springs took bits of information with them, but not the full understanding they were looking for. Dr. Hamilton told the innkeeper in private that he had found something in the mountains that he couldn't put into any category. He said that Abigail was a living puzzle, someone who confirmed and contradicted everything he thought he knew about folk medicine at the same time. The visit of the academic had an unexpected effect on the community. If educated and smart people from far away came to see Abigail, maybe the people who lived there didn't realize how valuable their mountains were. Even though she would always be a mystery, they felt proud to have that amazing healer in their area again. That summer, Abigail started doing something different. She would go to Webster Springs once a month and teach classes at the church that anyone could join. Anyone who wanted to learn about plants that can be used for medicine was welcome. She didn't tell her deepest secrets, but she did share basic information that could help families take better care of themselves. She taught how to find common plants that can help heal, how to make simple teas for everyday problems, and how to make basic ointments for small cuts and scrapes. Most of the people who came to these sessions were women who brought their older daughters. This started a tradition of passing on knowledge that would spread throughout the area in the years to come. Abigail was a patient but strict teacher. She made sure that everyone understood the ideas behind the practices and didn't just memorize the recipes. She wanted them to use their minds, look around, and trust their gut feelings about the natural world. Silas took on a big project during this time. The church in Webster Springs needed a new bell, but the old blacksmith who could have made it had died years before. Someone said that Silas might have the right skills. He thought about the offer for a few days before agreeing, but only if he could work in his own shop and not in front of other people. No one saw any progress for months. During this time, the smoke coming from the windowless building got thicker, and the sounds of hard work could be heard down the valley even at night. Some people in the area started to doubt that Silas would be able to finish the job. But one autumn morning he came down the mountain with the cart carrying something huge that was covered in heavy tarps. When the tarps were taken down in the middle of the square, they showed a bronze bell that left everyone speechless. Not only did it work, it was also a piece of art. Its surface was covered in detailed engravings that showed the essence of the mountains around it, like stylized trees, birds in flight, and streams that flowed in a winding way. When tested, the sound it made was clear and resonant, and it carried through the valleys with a purity that seemed to touch something deep inside the soul of anyone who heard it. No one asked Silas how he had made something so beautiful. At that point, the community had figured out that some questions would never be answered, and that it might be best to just enjoy the gifts the brothers gave them without trying to figure out all of their secrets. The bell became a symbol of Webster Springs itself. Its sound marked births, weddings, and deaths, reminding people that beauty and skill could grow even in the most remote places. We can now see how the brothers became a part of the community in ways that would have been impossible when they first moved to the mountains. They were no longer just outsiders. They were now important parts of the region's collective identity. What they did, both in real life and in spirit, had become an important part of what it meant to live in that part of the Appalachians. But even with all of this integration, the most important secrets stayed the same. The building without windows was still off-limits. The basement of the main house was still only for the siblings, and no one knew who they were before they got to those mountains. It seemed like Abigail and Silas had found the perfect balance. They were involved in the community enough to be valued, but they stayed far enough away to keep their full freedom. As autumn moved in, the mountains took on their usual colors, and smoke kept rising from the high-altitude property. This was a constant that had become as familiar as the mountains themselves, a constant reminder that some mysteries would never be solved.